Sometimes in life we meet people who believe they hold all the power. They think rules exist only for others, never for them. They hide behind titles, positions, or committees. But the truth is, no matter how high they climb, one thing always catches up with them: justice. That's exactly what happened in our quiet suburban neighborhood, where everything looked peaceful on the surface, but underneath a storm was brewing. You see, my sister had just moved into a lovely home. Beautiful lawn, white fence, roses blooming by the mailbox. She's a Supreme Court lawyer, though she rarely talks about it. She prefers to live like an ordinary person, kind, calm, and respectful to everyone. But peace doesn't last long when you have someone like Karen living nearby. Every neighborhood has one. The self-appointed ruler of the HOA. She was the kind of woman who carried a clipboard like a weapon and smiled only when she was about to ruin someone's day. At first, things were small. A note about the trash can being an inch too far from the curb, or a message about lawn color not matching the HOA standards. My sister laughed it off. "It's fine," she said. "Some people just need to feel important." But Karen wasn't just someone who needed attention. She was someone who wanted control. She started attending every HOA meeting like it was a courtroom drama, and anyone who disagreed with her was treated like a criminal. She'd talk for hours about maintaining community standards, yet her own fence was broken, and her yard looked like it hadn't seen sunlight in months. One morning, my sister came home from work still wearing her navy blue blazer and found an envelope taped to her front door. It wasn't a friendly note. It was a formal notice, signed by the HOA president, Karen herself. It said, "You are in violation of community appearance codes, unauthorized garden plants, and a mailbox that does not meet HOA design guidelines." My sister stood there in silence, reading it twice. Then she smiled, that calm, confident smile she gives before walking into court. She didn't react, didn't argue. She simply folded the letter, placed it on the kitchen counter, and went about her evening like nothing happened. But Karen wasn't finished. The next week, she came storming over while my sister was watering her roses. "You think you're above the rules?" She shouted loud enough for half the street to hear. "We'll see what the HOA has to say when I file my report." Now most people would argue. Most people would get angry. But my sister simply looked at her and said, "Karen, sometimes when people try too hard to control others, they end up losing control of themselves." Karen turned red. She marched away, muttering something about fines and legal actions. 2 weeks later, the real storm hit. My sister received a lawsuit notice. Karen had sued her on behalf of the HOA. The claim? Repeated violations and refusal to comply with neighborhood regulations. I'll never forget that night. My sister sat at the dining table with the letter in front of her, sipping tea slowly. "She actually sued me," she said quietly, almost amused. I expected her to be angry, maybe even scared. But instead, she looked peaceful, like someone who knew exactly what was coming. She said, "You know, I've argued in the Supreme Court, but this case, this might be the most satisfying one yet." And that's when I realized something. Karen had no idea who she was dealing with. She thought she was going to scare another homeowner into submission, like she'd done a dozen times before. But this time, she'd picked a fight with someone who understood the law better than anyone else in the neighborhood. A woman who defended justice for a living. That night, my sister stayed up late, not out of worry, but out of purpose. She opened her laptop, reviewed the HOA bylaws, and highlighted every line Karen had twisted or misused. Every unfair rule, every abuse of authority. By morning, she had a 32-page document ready, one that would change the way our HOA operated forever. When she walked into the HOA hearing the next week, the entire board looked nervous. Karen sat at the front, chin up, pretending to be confident. My sister greeted everyone kindly, took her seat, and calmly placed the thick folder in front of her. The moment the meeting started, Karen launched into her speech, dramatic, emotional, and full of false claims. She said things like, "This resident refuses to follow the law," and "we must set an example for the neighborhood." She even threw in words like disrespectful and defiant. Then it was my sister's turn. She spoke softly, but every word carried weight. "I respect this community," she began, "and I believe in fairness. But fairness cannot exist when rules are used as weapons. The HOA was created to protect homeowners, not to control them." As she continued, the room grew silent. Every eye was on her. Even those who once supported Karen began to shift uncomfortably. My sister presented emails, photos, and legal precedents, calmly, clearly, and without anger. When she finished, she simply said, "If this HOA chooses to continue this lawsuit, I'll be happy to meet you in court. But I assure you, I will also be filing a counterclaim for harassment, misuse of authority, and emotional distress." The silence that followed was unforgettable. Karen's confident smirk disappeared. Her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled her papers. The board members whispered among themselves. Within minutes, the meeting adjourned. As my sister walked out, a few neighbors approached her quietly. One of them whispered, "Thank you. We were too scared to speak before." That night, the neighborhood felt different. The same lawns, the same mailboxes, but something had changed. People started realizing they didn't have to fear Karen anymore. The power she had built on intimidation began to crumble, and for the first time in a long while, my sister smiled as she stood by her roses, watching the sunset. The next morning, the sun rose softly over the quiet street. Birds sang, sprinklers hissed, and for a moment, everything looked peaceful again. But peace in a neighborhood ruled by someone like Karen never lasts long. Karen couldn't stand losing control. To her, that HOA title wasn't just a position, it was power. And when she saw it slipping away, she became desperate to get it back. By noon, she was back at it again, sending emails to board members, calling emergency meetings, and spreading rumors. She told everyone that my sister was dangerous, that she was trying to ruin the community. It was classic Karen. When the facts failed, she used fear. But here's the thing about fear. It only works when people believe the lie. And this time, people didn't because word had already spread. The neighbors who used to stay quiet had found courage. They'd seen how calm and respectful my sister was even when attacked. They saw how she handled the situation with grace and truth. And for the first time, they began to talk. One neighbor, Mr. Davis, a retired teacher in his late 70s, said, "I've lived here for 20 years. I've never seen anyone stand up to Karen like that." Another woman said, "I got fined last year for having a bird feeder. Maybe it's time someone reviewed those rules." Karen didn't realize it, but she'd started a movement against herself. Meanwhile, my sister was working quietly behind the scenes. She didn't want revenge. She wanted change. She knew that power without accountability always ends badly. So she began preparing a detailed petition to reform the HOA bylaws, making sure no single person could misuse authority again. Every night, she'd sit at her kitchen table reading legal documents and writing notes. Her cat would curl up beside her and I'd bring her tea, watching her work in silence. She wasn't angry. She was focused. when I asked, "Why are you still putting so much effort into this?" "You already won," she smiled and said, "Winning isn't enough. I want everyone here to feel safe. That's what real justice means." That line stayed with me, because she was right. Some people fight only for themselves. But she fought for everyone. Then came the twist none of us expected. A few days later, Karen showed up at our doorstep, this time without her clipboard, without her usual arrogance. She looked tired. Her shoulders were slumped, and her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. She said, "Can we talk?" My sister nodded. They sat outside on the porch, the autumn breeze moving gently through the trees. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Karen sighed and said, "I didn't know you were a lawyer. I wanted people to follow the rules. I thought I was doing the right thing." My sister looked at her for a long moment and replied, "Rules aren't wrong, Karen, but when you use them to hurt people, they stop being rules and they become weapons." Karen looked down. "I guess I just wanted respect." My sister said softly, "Respect doesn't come from fear. It comes from kindness." There was a pause, the kind that feels heavy yet healing. Karen nodded slowly, then whispered, "I'm sorry." It was one of those moments that remind you people can change, even those who seem impossible to reason with. Of course, not everything changed overnight. Some board members still clung to old habits, some rules still needed rewriting, but something inside the community had shifted. The fear was gone. The silence was gone. Within weeks, the petition my sister drafted gathered signatures from nearly every homeowner. Even Karen signed it. It was presented at the next HOA meeting, and for the first time in years, the board voted unanimously for change. The new bylaws limited the HOA president's power, created a fair complaint system, and introduced a code of conduct, ensuring no homeowner could ever be harassed again. When the meeting ended, neighbors clapped. Some even stood up and hugged my sister. Mr. Davis wiped away a tear and said, "You brought peace back to this street." But my sister, ever humble, smiled and said, "No, Mr. Davis." We all did. After that, life slowly returned to normal. The lawns grew green again. The laughter of children filled the cul-de-sacs. People started greeting each other in the mornings instead of avoiding eye contact. It was like the neighborhood had found its heart again. Karen surprisingly became quieter. She stopped patrolling the streets with her clipboard. Instead, she started volunteering at local events, planting flowers in the community park. Some said she was trying to make amends. Others said she just wanted peace too. And honestly, my sister didn't care which one it was. She believed in giving people a second chance. One evening, as the sky turned orange and the air grew still, I found her standing by the roses again, watering them slowly. I asked, "Do you think she really changed?" She smiled gently and said, "Maybe. But that's not what matters. What matters is that we did what was right. And that's something no one can take away." Then she added something I'll never forget. "You know, people think justice only happens in courtrooms. But sometimes it happens right here, in the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to stay silent." I felt a lump in my throat. Because she wasn't just talking about Karen. She was talking about all of us. For years, that neighborhood had lived under the weight of fear, of silence, of someone else's control. But one act of courage, one quiet stand, had changed everything. That night, as the porch light glowed and the crickets sang, I realized something profound. Justice isn't loud. It doesn't always come with applause or headlines. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and deeply human. The lawsuit didn't disappear overnight. Even after the new bylaws were passed, there were still papers to file, meetings to attend, and signatures to collect. Legal systems move slowly, but truth, it always moves forward. Weeks turned into months, and during that time, something interesting happened. The same neighbors who once avoided Karen began to see her differently. They didn't forget what she did, but they noticed she was changing. She started greeting people instead of inspecting them. She stopped complaining about lawns and started asking about families. Sometimes change begins with shame, but it continues with courage. One afternoon, the HOA received the final notice from the court. The case, Karen versus the HOA and sister's name, was officially dismissed. The judge ruled that the lawsuit was filed with insufficient grounds and signs of personal bias. In simpler words, the whole thing was nonsense. Karen was fined for misuse of HOA authority. It wasn't a huge fine, but enough to make her realize the cost of her pride. My sister, on the other hand, refused to demand compensation. When I asked her why, she said, "Because sometimes peace is worth more than payment." Those words hit deep. Because it takes real strength to walk away when you could easily win more. After the ruling, the community held a small gathering at the park. It wasn't planned. It just happened naturally. People brought food, kids ran around, and neighbors who hadn't spoken in years laughed together again. My sister was there too, wearing her usual calm smile, chatting with everyone like she'd known them forever. Karen showed up as well, standing a little away at first, unsure if she was welcome. My sister noticed her, walked straight over, and said, "Come join us." Karen hesitated. "After everything that happened." "Are you sure?" My sister smiled and said, "Everyone makes mistakes." "Karen, what matters is what we do after them." That was the moment something healed, not just between them, but in the whole neighborhood. Later that evening, as the sky turned deep purple and the streetlights began to flicker on, people shared their stories, quiet confessions of how they'd been afraid to speak, how they'd paid unfair fines, how they'd stayed silent just to avoid trouble. Mr. Davis said softly, "I used to think one voice couldn't change anything, but now I see it only takes one voice to start the echo." Everyone nodded, because they all knew. That one voice was my sister's. When the crowd finally began to leave, Karen approached my sister again. She handed her a small envelope and said, "I wrote something for you." Inside was a handwritten note. The handwriting was shaky but sincere. It read, "Thank you for reminding me what leadership means. I forgot somewhere along the way. I'll do better from now on." My sister folded the note carefully, placed it in her bag, and said, "That's all anyone can do. Try again." From that day forward, Karen became almost unrecognizable. She stepped down as HOA president but volunteered to help with community events. She organized a donation drive for the local shelter, and for the first time in years, people showed up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The fear that once hung over the neighborhood had turned into something else: pride. People began painting their fences, planting flowers, fixing old benches. The street that once felt divided now felt alive again. And my sister, she didn't boast, didn't post about it, didn't even tell her colleagues. To her, it wasn't about winning. It was about restoring balance. Sometimes I'd find her sitting quietly on the porch at sunset, tea in hand, looking at the street. One evening I asked, "Do you ever miss the courtroom battles?" She smiled faintly and said, "No, those are fights for law." But this was a fight for people, and that's what truly matters. I think that's what made her different. She didn't use her power to crush others. She used it to protect them. And maybe that's why her story spread beyond our little neighborhood. A few months later, a local newspaper picked it up. The headline read, "Supreme Court lawyer brings justice to her neighborhood," without a courtroom. People all over the city read about it. Letters began arriving at her mailbox, from strangers thanking her for standing up to unfair HOA boards, from retirees saying they finally felt brave enough to speak out, from widows who said they'd been harassed for years but now had hope. Each letter made her smile, but she never let it change her. "They don't need a hero," she said once. "They just need to believe they have power too." As time passed, Karen's apology turned into action. She started attending town meetings, but this time she listened more than she spoke. She became known as someone who helped instead of someone who hurts. It wasn't perfect. No one ever is. But the difference was real. And slowly, everyone began to understand the same lesson my sister had taught from the very start. Rules are meant to protect people, not to control them. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. And strength isn't shown through anger. It's shown through patience. Looking back, I sometimes think about that first letter Karen taped to the door. That single piece of paper started a storm that changed dozens of lives. Funny how something so small can wake an entire community. Maybe that's the hidden beauty of life. We never know which moment will define us or which challenge will reveal who we truly are. Time passed, and the memory of the lawsuit slowly faded into the background like an old photograph kept in a drawer. The seasons changed. The trees turned gold, then bare, then green again. The street that once felt tense now echoed with laughter, neighborly greetings, and the soft hum of normal life. But for my sister, that chapter remained unforgettable. Not because of the fight, but because of what it revealed, how fragile peace can be when people forget compassion. One evening, months later, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Karen again. This time, there was no fear, no tension, just quiet respect. She held a small potted plant in her hands, a single white rose. "I thought you might like this," she said. "A peace offering." My sister smiled, took the plant gently, and said, "You didn't have to." Karen shook her head. "No, I needed to. You taught me something important, that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength." The two women stood there for a while, watching the sunset together, and for the first time, there was genuine peace between them. It was strange, in a beautiful way, to see how time had turned enemies into something almost like friends. The same street that once divided them was now the thing that connected them. A few weeks later, my sister hosted a small gathering at her house. She called it Tea and Talk. It wasn't anything fancy, just an open invitation for neighbors to come by, share stories, and build connection. People came. They brought pies, cookies, laughter, and warmth. Even the quiet ones who usually stayed inside showed up. And there, sitting among them, was Karen, listening, smiling, and even laughing. At one point, an elderly man, Mr. Davis again, raised his cup and said, "Here's to this street. We've had our battles, but we found our way back." Everyone clapped softly. My sister looked around the room and said, "It's not about winning or losing. It's about understanding that we all share this little piece of the world. And if we don't protect it together, we lose it together." Those words hung in the air like music. Simple, true, unforgettable. As the evening ended and people began to leave, Karen stayed behind to help clean up. She said, You know, I used to think leadership meant being in control. Now I know it means being there. For others. My sister smiled. You figured it out, Karen nodded. Thanks to you. After she left, my sister stood at the window watching the soft glow of porch lights across the street. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, almost to herself, she whispered, "Maybe that's how change really happens. One heart at a time." The months rolled by peacefully. The HOA ran smoother than ever. Meetings were shorter, friendlier, and actually productive. Instead of gossip, there was cooperation. Instead of tension, there was trust. And just like that, the neighborhood had healed. People began to realize that what happened wasn't just about an HOA conflict. It was about every small battle in life, every moment when someone chooses pride over kindness, control over compassion. When people forget empathy, communities break. But when one person stands up for what's right, with grace, not anger, everything can change. A year later, my sister received a letter from the state legal board. It wasn't about work. It was an invitation to speak at a community conference about justice beyond the courtroom. At first, she hesitated. She didn't see herself as a public speaker. But I told her, "You lived that lesson. Who better to share it?" So she went. And when she stood on that stage in front of hundreds of people, she didn't talk about laws or legal terms. She talked about humanity. She said, justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in neighborhoods, in living rooms, in how we treat each other every day. The law can fix wrongs, but only kindness can heal hearts. When she finished, the audience gave her a standing ovation. Not because she was a Supreme Court lawyer, but because she reminded them of something we all forget, that justice, in its purest form, is love guided by truth. After the event, several people came up to her telling their own stories. Stories of unfair treatment, neighborhood disputes, broken friendships, and how they wished they had handled things differently. One woman in her 60s said, "I wish I had your courage." My sister smiled and said, "You already do. You just have to use it." That night as she drove home, she passed by our old street. She slowed down, looked at the familiar houses, and smiled. The lawns were bright, the mailboxes freshly painted, and on one of them, Karen's mailbox, there was a small white rose planted beside it. It was like life's quiet way of saying, "It's all okay now." She parked her car, stepped out, and stood by her roses once again, the same spot where it all began. The air was cool, and the night sky shimmered with stars. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling peace settle deep inside her. And then she said softly, "Sometimes the loudest victories are the quiet ones." Final reflection, CTA. If you've listened to this far, maybe this story reminded you of something in your own life. Maybe someone wronged you. Maybe you've been silent when you should have spoken. Or maybe you've carried anger for too long. But here's the truth. Peace doesn't come from revenge. It comes from courage, patience, and forgiveness. So if you're watching this right now, I want you to remember this. You have more power than you think. You can stand up for what's right, calmly, kindly, and firmly. And when you do, you don't just change one situation, you change the world around you. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it. Comment your thoughts. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us all what humanity still means. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear this. That kindness still wins. Always.